The German High Command promised an Iron Cross for destroying one specific target. Not a battleship, not a state-of-the-art bomber. It was for a plane made of wood and canvas. You're looking at the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Forces. And here is the fact that changes everything. Every single pilot, navigator, and mechanic was a woman. Most were volunteers, barely out of their teens, some as young as 17. Their existence was a direct result of one woman's persistence, Marina Raskova, a celebrity aviator, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, who convinced Stalin himself that women could and should fly in combat. The result was 3 all-female air regiments. The 588th was given the worst equipment. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, was an obsolete crop duster, a biplane. It had 2 open cockpits, no radio, and no armor to speak of. The official records don't mention that for months they were denied parachutes, deemed too valuable to waste on women. Think about that for a moment. Flying into enemy fire, knowing there is no escape. Their male counterparts mockingly called their planes sewing machines. And here's where the story defies all logic. Their plane was so with a top speed of just 152 kilometers per hour that it could fly below the stall speed of the German Messerschmitt fighters. If a German pilot tried to down to match their pace, his own plane would fall out of the sky. This weakness became their greatest weapon. They flew exclusively in the dark, in total blackness over the vast Russian steppe, navigating with only a map, a pencil, and a compass. As they approached their targets, they would cut their engines completely and glide. The only sound they made was a soft, eerie whooshing noise through the air. German soldiers on the ground said it sounded like a witch's broomstick. They gave them a name, Nachthexen, the night witches. And they were absolutely terrified of them, because these women didn't just fly one mission a night. Their flimsy planes could only carry 2 bombs at a time, strapped crudely under the wings. So they would return to base, rearm in the dark, refuel, and fly again, and again, up to 8, sometimes 18 times in a single night. From dusk until dawn. In the freezing Russian winter, with temperatures dropping to minus 45 degrees Celsius, their hands would stick to the frozen metal controls. Their faces became masks of ice. Frostbite was a constant enemy. Many never returned from these flights into the void, yet they flew over 24,000 combat missions and dropped 23,000 tons of explosives on the German army. They became the most decorated female unit in Soviet history, a legend whispered on both sides of the front. But the German fighters they evaded nightly were not their most dangerous enemy. Their most dangerous enemy wasn't a German ace in a Messerschmitt. It was the machine they were forced to fly, and the air it flew through. You see, the Polikarpov Po-2 was never designed for combat. It was a trainer, a crop duster. Its frame was brittle pine wood. Its skin was simple fabric, stretched tight and varnished. A single incendiary bullet from a night fighter could turn the entire aircraft into a falling inferno in less than 10 seconds. And there were no parachutes. Think about what that means. Every flight was a choice to burn alive or fall to your death. There was no third option. The official records from the Engels Military Aviation School, where they trained, show the women were allotted the oldest, most worn-out planes, the ones the male regiments had already rejected. This detail is rarely mentioned. Their bombs weren't held in a sophisticated bay. They were strapped to crude racks under the lower wings, held in place by a simple wire. To release them, The navigator had to lean out of her open cockpit into the freezing slipstream and pull a release cable by hand. They had no advanced bomb sight. Their targeting computer was a grease pencil mark on the cockpit window. And here's the part that sounds impossible. To hit a target as small as a fuel truck or a supply depot from 3,000 meters up in total darkness. They had to be perfect, every single time. But the plane itself was just one part of the equation. The other enemy was the Russian winter. Temperatures on the front regularly plunged to minus 45 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the plane's grease froze solid. The controls became stiff, almost immovable. The engine, a mere 110 horsepower, struggled to turn over. The mechanics, also young women, would work for hours in the open, warming the engines with blowtorches, their bare hands sticking to the frozen metal tools. Frostbite claimed more fingers than combat. Once airborne, you were flying inside a wind tunnel of pure cold. The wind would tear at your face, freezing your goggles to your skin. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, landed after a mission unable to feel her feet. They had frozen solid to the rudder pedals. Medics had to cut her boots off, taking chunks of skin with them. She was flying again within weeks. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the daily reality. Now consider navigation. You have no radio, no GPS, just a map, a compass, and the stars, if you could see them. In a blizzard, you were blind. A wrong turn didn't just mean getting lost. It meant flying until your fuel ran out, then a forced landing in an endless expanse of snow. It meant freezing to death, your plane a tiny lost speck in a world of white. And they did this 8, 10, sometimes 18 times a night. Fly, land, refuel, rearm, take off. A relentless soul-crushing cycle from dusk until dawn. The women slept just a few hours at a time, often in their flight gear, in unheated barns or dugouts near the airfield. Exhaustion was a constant predator. They would see their friends take off into the dark and simply never return. No explosion, no radio call, just an empty space in the sky and an empty cot in the morning. The official Soviet report celebrated their tonnage, dropped and missions flown. They spoke less of the attrition from mechanical failure, or from disorientation, from the sheer grinding human cost. By 1943, the Germans were no longer just dismissive. They were furious, and they adapted. They set up rings of powerful searchlights around key targets, coordinated with batteries of 3.7-centimeter anti-aircraft cannons. They called them flak circuses. For the night witches, flying into one was a death sentence. The moment your tiny plane crossed the invisible perimeter, a dozen brilliant white beams would snap onto you, pinning you against the black sky like an insect under a microscope. You were blinded, disoriented, and then the shells would start exploding all around you. The Germans had created a perfect killing box of light and steel. There was no outrunning the shells. There was no armor to protect you. So, with their engines silent and their wings made of fabric, how did these women plan to fly through a wall of fire and live? They answered the wall of fire by becoming ghosts. You see, they didn't fly through the German killing box. They played with it. They developed a tactic of flying in pairs, or sometimes threes. 2 planes would enter the searchlight zone first. Their job? To get caught, to deliberately fly into the blinding white beams, drawing every searchlight, every anti-aircraft gun towards them. Think about that choice. You are the bait. As the sky erupted around them, a third plane, with its engine cut, would glide through the newly created shadows below. Unseen, unheard, dropping its 2 bombs on the target before the Germans even knew it was there. The official reports called this a diversionary tactic. It was a suicide run with a 50-50 chance of return. But it worked. Again and again. May the Night Witches turned the Germans' greatest defense into a fatal blind spot. The Germans were losing supplies, ammunition, and men. And they were being humiliated by what they saw as female peasants in obsolete crop dusters. The High Command was furious. This is the part of the story the propaganda films leave out. By mid-1943, the Germans stopped treating the witches as a nuisance. They began treating them as a strategic threat, and they assigned a specialist to hunt them down. His name was Oberleutnant Josef Koschak, a decorated night fighter ace of the Luftwaffe's 4th Nachtjagdgeschwader 4. His mission was simple: eradicate the 588th Regiment. Koschak wasn't flying blind. The Germans had equipped his Messerschmitt Bf 110 with airborne radar. He could see in the dark. And unlike the pilots who struggled to match the P-02's low speed, Koschak perfected a new attack technique. He would approach from below and behind, where the P-02 had its largest blind spot, pull up his nose, and fire. One short burst was all it took to turn the wood and fabric plane into a plume of fire. For the first time, the hunters were being hunted. The women now had a personal devil in the sky above them. They could feel his presence. One night, pilot Raisa Aronova was caught by Koschak. She threw her plane into a violent slip, a maneuver no textbook would recommend for a Po-2. She flew so low that her wheels were clipping the tops of trees, using the forest as a shield. Koschak followed, his cannons tearing through the branches around her. He made pass after pass, but she refused to die. She made it back to base in a plane that looked more like a skeleton, with over 40 bullet holes in its frame. The official records show that on the night of July 31st, 1943, Josef Koschak shot down 4 Po-2 aircraft in under an hour. 4 planes, 8 women, gone. For this, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. The award citation specifically mentioned his success against the Nachthexen. The psychological pressure was immense. Every takeoff was a roll of the dice. You weren't just flying against the cold, against mechanical failure, against anti-aircraft fire. You were now flying against a man whose entire purpose was to find you and kill you. And he was very, very good at his job. But here is the detail that is never mentioned in the German war records. While Koschak was hunting them, the Night Witches were also hunting him. They documented his tactics, and they learned the sound of his specific engine. They started flying even lower, even more erratically, turning their flights into a deadly game of cat and mouse just meters above the ground. The predator had become the prey. The women of the 588th were determined to bring down the witch hunter themselves. They swore they would be the ones to end his reign, but they never got the chance. On September 26, 1943, just 2 months after receiving his medal, Josef Koschak died. He wasn't shot down in a blaze of glory by a vengeful night witch. He wasn't outmaneuvered in a dogfight. His plane crashed while landing. There was no celebration on the Soviet airfields, no victory toast for an enemy who simply fell from the sky. The death of Josef Koschak was just a brief, quiet pause in a war that demanded more bodies. The next night, the women flew again. And the night after that. The hunter was gone, but the hunt never ended. Here is the part of the story that is rarely told. While the state was printing posters of smiling, invincible female aviators, the women themselves were quietly breaking. They were celebrated as living legends, awarded the highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. But the official narrative omits what happened between the missions. It omits the letters they wrote home, stained with engine oil and tears. Letters that were read by censors searching for any hint of despair. You see, the state needed super soldiers. What it had were teenagers, exhausted and grieving. Think about what that does to you. Flying mission after mission, watching the cots in your barracks become empty, one by one. One of those pilots was Nadezhda Popova. By 1944, she had flown hundreds of missions. On one flight, navigating through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, her Po-2 was shredded. She counted 42 bullet holes. She nursed the dying plane back over friendly lines before crashing in a field. Dazed, she climbed from the wreckage and met another downed pilot. A man. His name was Semyon Kharlamov. They sat there in the mud of no man's land and talked for hours. They would marry after the war and stay together for 45 years. But for every story of survival, there are others that end in the dark. Consider Vera Bellick and Tatiana Makarova. They were inseparable, on the best of friends. Tatiana was the pilot, Vera the navigator. They flew together, ate together. They promised to see the war through together. On August 25, 1944, on their 813th mission, their plane was hit by a German fighter over Poland. It burst into flames. Both women were killed. They were 22 and 23 years old. This was the reality hidden behind the medals. The propaganda showed women of steel. The truth was far more human. They held each other as they cried for their dead friends. They adopted stray dogs at the airfields to have something to care for. They embroidered flowers onto their plain military maps, small acts of defiance against the crushing machinery of war. They were not super soldiers. They were young women pushed beyond every imaginable limit who simply refused to stop. They just kept flying. Through ice, through fire, through a grief so profound it threatened to swallow them whole. By 1945, they had flown all the way to Berlin. They had seen the fall of the Reich. They had outlasted the enemies in the sky and the demons within. They had won. But as they returned home, their uniforms heavy with medals, they would face a battle they never saw coming. A battle not for the sky, but for their own story. Battle for their story began the moment the war ended. You would think that these women, the most decorated female unit in Soviet history, would return as national heroes. And in a way, they did. But here is the detail that is almost never mentioned. On June 24, 1945, the Soviet Union held its massive victory parade in Moscow's Red Square. Tanks rumbled past the Kremlin, fighter planes screamed overhead, thousands of soldiers marched in triumph. But the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was not invited. The official reason given was that their planes were too to keep formation with the modern aircraft. Think about that. The very weakness that had been their greatest weapon was now the excuse used to erase them from their own victory celebration. Their war was over. Their stories were inconvenient. When they returned home, trading their worn flight suits for civilian clothes, they tried to enroll in flight academies only to be told aviation is not a woman's place. Many who spoke of their hundreds of combat missions were met with polite disbelief. Some were even accused of lying. It was easier for the men who returned to believe these stories were exaggerations than to accept that a 19-year-old woman had been more daring than they were. For decades, their history was a whisper, a footnote in the official male-dominated narrative of the Great Patriotic War. The state had used them when it needed them. Now it preferred they remain silent. But ghosts have a way of making themselves heard. In the 1960s, a journalist named Irina Rakobolskaya, who had served as the regiment's chief of staff, began collecting their stories. She and her comrades published their memoirs. They started speaking to schools.ly. Painstakingly, they fought their way back into the light. Statues were eventually raised. Streets were named in their honor. Their obsolete biplane, the sewing machine, was placed in museums. The 30 members who were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union were finally given their full due. The last of them, like Nadezhda Popova, lived long lives, their eyes still carrying the memory of the night sky over a burning front. But they are all gone now. The last engine has fallen silent. Their voices now exist only in these records, in old photographs, in the fading ink of their letters home. And it leaves you with a question. Their story was almost lost, buried by the very system they